Our next section today is the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. The PNS is all of the nervous tissue, all of the nervous system that is not part of the central nervous system. It's still involved with the central nervous system, it's still connected to it. Basically, the PNS is going to transmit to and receive messages from the central nervous system. So the PNS is made up of nerves and sensory receptors. Sensory receptors, we're going to cover these fast because we're going to do a lot on sensory receptors down the road, but sensory receptors are all about detecting stimuli, any kind of stimuli. So visual, auditory, chemical, pressure, temperature, anything like that. That is a stimulus that the body is going to detect. That is going to be accomplished by sensory receptors, and we'll talk about those in a lot more detail next week. Nerves are bundles of axons that radiate outwards from the central nervous system. So we have cranial nerves that originate from the kind of hind part of the brain here, and those innervate, meaning they radiate kind of into the head and the upper body. So you're looking at things like the jaw or the nose, like those nerves, those are cranial nerves. Everything else is spinal nerves. So that's all the rest of these nerves here. These are spinal nerves, meaning they are radiating outwards from the spinal cord. So the difference between these two is not structural, it's just where they come from, directly from the brain or from the spinal cord. Within the peripheral nervous system, there are two functional components, basically two sides to the peripheral nervous system. One is the signal coming in, and the other is the signal going out. The part of the peripheral nervous system that involves signals coming in is called afferent or sensory. So this is where you have a signal that goes from a sensory receptor to the central nervous system. The things that are involved in the afferent functions of the peripheral nervous system are sensory receptors, but they are not effectors, things that are going to respond to stimuli. There are two types of senses that our body can detect, basically two types of stimuli we're able to respond to. There are visceral senses. These are things that we're not consciously aware of, things like our blood pressure. So, which is nice. So you think about your body is monitoring things like your blood pH, your blood pressure, your oxygen in certain components of your body. You're not consciously thinking about that stuff, but your body is monitoring it in the background. Those are visceral senses. And then somatic senses are things that you are aware of, things that you can consciously perceive. So that's going to be things like vision or sound. Those are your somatic senses. When, like, think back to kindergarten and you learned like the five senses, right? Taste, touch, sight, hearing, and smell, right? Those five, those are your somatic senses. So we look over here in our big picture view of the nervous system kind of functional arrangement. On the left, we have the afferent side of the peripheral nervous system. This is where the stimuli goes to receptors and then into neurons that will be transmitted to the central nervous system. The other side of the peripheral nervous system is the efferent or motor functions. This is where we take a signal from the central nervous system and it gets sent out to the efferent neurons, the efferent part of the peripheral nervous system, and it ultimately ends up at effectors. Effectors are just things that are responding to that signal from the CNS to do something. So like muscles are effectors. Now there are two components to the efferent system. There is the motor system, which involves skeletal muscles. So over here, we have the motor system that's going to be control of the skeletal muscles. These are things that you control voluntarily, things like the muscles in your arms or your fingers to grasp something. That's part of the motor system. Reflexes that we previously talked about are also part of the motor system. And then the other side is the autonomic nervous system. This is stuff that we're not doing consciously. So this is where we're going from our efferent neurons to things like our heart, smooth muscles, glands, things that our body controls, but we do not consciously control. This is, think about this like the operating system of a computer that's running in the background. It's doing all the stuff that we're doing consciously, like word processing. That's the motor system. But all the stuff that's running in the background of your computer operating system, that's your autonomic nervous system. It's just there, it's humming along, you don't have to think about it. Now, there are three divisions to this system. They're kind of three functional realms of the autonomic nervous system, and we call them divisions. The first is the enteric division. We are not going to talk about this right now. This has to do with the digestive tract, the pancreas, the gallbladder. We're going to talk about this when we talk about how digestion and appetite is regulated, but we're not going to do any more than this. This is all that's on this slide for today, so don't worry about enteric. We'll get to this later. The other two are basically the opposite of each other. So we have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic autonomic nervous system divisions. These are basically inverse responses to each other. So the parasympathetic is sometimes called the rest and digest system, or the rest and digest response. So these are going to be things basically, you don't have to know all the stuff on here, but you should know some of the things that I'm going to point out. So for example, slow the heart rate, stimulate the digestive activity, constrict bronchi of the lungs, basically things that mean you're going to slow everything down, you're going to slow metabolism, and you're going to primarily focus on things like digestion. The sympathetic response, or the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, refers to the fight or flight response. So this is where we're going to relax the bronchi in the lungs so we can get more air. We're going to accelerate the heart rate and inhibit the activity of the digestive system. So we've talked about this before. The sympathetic division of the peripheral nervous system is stimulated when you have an adrenaline response, when your adrenal medulla releases epinephrine or adrenaline. Basically, that stimulates this set of responses. It's saying, get ready to run, get ready to do active things that require a lot of energy. And as far as that stuff going on in the background, like digestion, hold off on that. We'll do more of that later. So that's the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions of the autonomic peripheral nervous system. Regardless of which system we're using, autonomic or motor, the signal through the nervous system is basically the same. And in this pathway, I want you to see here that there are kind of two places where the peripheral nervous system plays a role. So here we have the afferent side of the PNS. So we start with a stimulus that stimulates a sensory receptor, and that transmits that signal to afferent neurons. Those neurons pass that signal to the central nervous system where it is processed, and then the CNS relays the response signal out via efferent neurons. Those are going to go to either the motor or the autonomic system, where you're going to signal an effector that is going to elicit some response. So like a muscle is an example of an effector. The muscle contracting is the response. It could also be a gland is the effector. So releasing a certain hormone from a gland could be the response at the end of this pathway. The idea here is the in part and the out part are both the peripheral nervous system, and the processing in the middle is via the central nervous system. And that's why I want you to think about these two parts of this topic, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system together, and think about those two sets of outcomes basically as one group, because you can't functionally separate the PNS from the CNS. They always work together.